Hi folks, welcome to week 4. For last week, this week, and next week, we're talking about issues of research methodology. One very important component to research methods is a discussion of research ethics. That's why for this week's lesson assignment, I've assigned y'all to complete your research ethics certification. For more information, see the lessons and or the assignments tools for more details. Remember that it's due Wednesday. In terms of your research ethics certification, remember this is something that you only ever have to do once and that you can put on your resume so that as you're applying for jobs, etc., you should list this under certifications. So one of the biggest challenges for research ethics is that there are some answers to questions about how people think and behave that are really often best accessed through research that is ethically dubious at best. So this week our presentation's a little bit different. There are 3 things to watch. The first, obviously, is the lecture. I'm going to move pretty quickly through the lecture because it's designed to reinforce the information that you'll learn in the ethics training and in a lot of ways to set up our 2 videos and bring out some other related issues. The second is a 10-minute video about the Milgram experiments. The third is a 30-minute video on the Stanford prison studies. Watch them in that order and make sure that you take good notes because you'll be responsible for all 3 for the quiz as well as using them as a basis for your discussion question 2 for this week. So as we begin, I want to take a look at some broad ethical principles. The first couple are really about the research design and how the research design affects the ethical process. So the first of these is worthwhile research goals. An assumption here is that research needs to have a purpose because there are always costs involved. These can be costs to the participants, financial costs to conducting the research, any number of things. So there always has to be a good reason for doing it, not just the we thought it would be interesting kind of factor. So the way that we measure being worthwhile comes in 4 different packages. First, that research does social good. If we think about this, that specific people or groups are generally benefited from research that's conducted. If we think about public opinion research, journalism, and frankly most academic research, this is our argument for our worthwhile research goals, is that we're uncovering information that is of some kind of benefit to society. Second, research, and a lot of research is taken on that's designed to improve an organization's performance. This is really important for the productivity issues, for profit and loss kinds of issues, also important in terms of social issues within organizations as well, and a commercial application of research. Third, research to make the world a better place. A lot of medical research falls under this, environmental studies, renewable energy, all of those kinds of types of research that are designed to functionally improve the way we live or how we interact with the world around us. And fourth, improvement for a particular client. This isn't necessarily organization's performance, but it's some kind of focus on what does the client need in order to better meet their own goals. So that second and fourth one really focus on commercial applications. This is an important part of research because a lot of research gets done because of the commercial applications, and it's used as a tool in a lot of instances for organizations to get what they want. For example, and when it's done unethically, if we think about it this way, one of the reasons that the tobacco industry was held so liable in the 1997 tobacco settlement was because they had fudged their research a bit, to put it as mildly as humanly possible. They misled their clinical research, or their clinical research misled people into thinking that cigarettes were less harmful for their health than they actually were. So there are ethical implications across a wide variety of types of research. So I want to look at another design principle, which is scientific research design. We're going to talk a lot more about this. That's certainly the topic for this week. But for example, one of the components is asking the right questions and that those questions are well formatted. This is something we're going to talk about next week for sure. Second and third, that relevant data are being analyzed and that the documentation process is very systematic. Now, these last two are both about the design that we're talking about next week and the mode that we're talking about this week. These are ethical issues because basically badly written measures, badly collected data, misleading data can really hurt participants as well as society. I'll give you an example of harming participants. In the early part of the 20th century, the Tuskegee studies, probably the most infamous example of unethical research, was conducted where African Americans in the South who tested positive for syphilis were being told that they were being treated for syphilis, when really what the researchers were interested in was their death. Watching the progression of syphilis, understanding its effects on the human body, etc. These folks were never actually treated, and there are a lot of people who died in the name of conducting research. So this was not a well-designed scientific study. In terms of society, like the text talked about last week, when we think about the journalists or anyone who interprets data badly, or the organizations, companies that give journalists bad data, then they report those findings and people make decisions that might harm them, might not be in their best interests, etc. That's another example of how scientific research design can impact the ethical component as well. So the next 4 slides identify the core principles of what actually makes research ethical. The first of these principles is the avoidance of harm. First, we have to pay attention to vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups, for example, prisoners, anyone who's institutionalized, the homeless, children. These are all examples of people who can be easily manipulated in the interests of research. They have something at stake that the researcher, because of power, for money, for any number of reasons, can really take advantage of and potentially harm these particular groups. Vulnerable populations are populations that have to be reviewed very carefully, and that it's actually fairly difficult to get access to because of the risks posed to them. Second is sensitive subject matter. Sensitive subject matter is subject matter that can really affect people. It's more than mere offensiveness. For example, this cardboard cutout in downtown that looks like New York, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, in a downtown area, that's kind of funny. Potentially offensive, but kind of funny. But the sensitive subject matter really focuses more as an issue of ethics on putting people into traumatic situations. You'll see examples of this being violated in both the Milgram and the Stanford prison experiments. So as you're watching those, look for evidence of researchers failing to avoid harm, or, put another way, causing harm to their participants. There's also, though, research protection. Ethical research not only is designed to protect the researcher, or the participants, but also the researcher from litigation, from personal and professional harm that can come out of badly designed and unethical research. The bottom line is that the avoidance of harm is about doing everything that we can to protect everyone involved in the research process. The second broad ethical principle is informed consent. Informed consent means understanding enough of the risks and the possible rewards to make a reasonable evaluation for participants to decide if they want to participate or not in the particular study. This can often be a challenge with experiments because deception is often a part of experiments, but we have to understand that making sure that participants are going to roughly know what's expected of them, what their risks and rewards are a critical component to informed consent. 3 supporting issues are: first, the method for obtaining. Really, the written is the best protection of all. What a written statement of informed consent is that the researcher lays out functionally a contract of what the participant should expect in terms of their time, in terms of their risks, and in terms of their benefits. The participant signs that saying, I understand, I am aware, and I have chosen to participate in this study. It's a legal document, but it's also about making sure that we are treating our research participants with as much integrity and honesty as possible. A component to that is the sufficient background information. The Tuskegee experiments failed to offer that kind of background information. Now, medical experiments, for example, if there is a possibility that someone's not going to be treated, that they could randomly be selected into a group not treated, they have to be informed of that potential. So informed consent isn't about telling them what their role is or whether or not they're getting some particular treatment, but to say that these are the potentials in this study. Third, minors. Minors cannot actually enter legal contracts, so they cannot give legal informed consent. So what's important with minors, and this is why they're also a vulnerable population, is that not only does the minor need to freely participate, but their legal parent or guardian has to sign the informed consent form. There has to be that level of documentation in order to make sure that kids are not somehow exploited. Now, what's interesting about informed consent is that this does not apply to public behavior. So we could go to New Orleans and study partying behavior, watching particular individuals without getting any kind of informed consent. What's interesting with with different modes of research is that the basic pen and paper survey, it's pretty clear that you can have informed consent there. But what about the internet? Participating in research on the internet, public forums, etc., is a little bit more of a gray space. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Our third broad ethical principle is voluntary consent. Bottom line, we cannot compel people to participate or even create a feeling of obligation that people need to participate or to stay in a particular study. One of the challenges here is undue financial reward. For example, I could give you all $100 for participating in a very risky research study, and while, we could all use the $100, if it was something that made you very uncomfortable, y'all would be in a financial position most likely to say no. It's a very different kind of a story if I offered that to homeless folks. There's really no reasonable way that most people who are homeless could afford not to take the $100. So that's what I'm talking about with undue kind of rewards. So people have to feel free to participate and withdraw at any time. For both the last one, the informed consent, as well as this principle, voluntary consent, be sure to look for evidence of these standards being violated in both the Milgram and the Stanford prison experiments. Fourth and finally, is the respect for privacy. There's a number of issues that are related here. The first of which is the confidentiality and or anonymity guarantees. Now, confidentiality and anonymity are different things. Confidentiality means that I know who answered what, and I promise not to tell anyone who you are. Basically, what happened in Vegas stays in Vegas, kind of thing. But we all know who went to Vegas. That's the point. Anonymity is a very different kind of thing because anonymity suggests that the researcher could not connect any particular individual to any particular response. So you participate and you have absolutely no risk of anyone finding out that you answered a particular answer. In theory, your course evaluations are set up as an anonymous study of your evaluation of the course. For that very reason, confidentiality would be your group evaluations. I know who said what about everyone, but you all don't. That's confidentiality. How the data is stored and disposed of. Here's the thing, that once you have the data, in order to protect confidentiality and anonymity, you have to have a plan as a researcher for making sure that information doesn't get out. At Harvard in the 60s, there were some body type studies. I can't remember exactly what they were, but there are a lot of high-power folks, for example, Hillary Clinton, who were photographed in the nude. Now, those pictures have been made public to varying degrees. That is an example of a bad storing and disposing of data, a lack of respect for these people's privacy. They were told that these were just going to be used for the research, that no one would ever see them, and then they come popping up 20, 30, 40 years later. That's the type of issue with a lot of research, especially on sensitive subject matter, that if you cannot guarantee the respect for privacy, then you're really committing ethical problems. Research is built on a relationship of trust between the researcher and the participant. It is the researcher's absolute ethical obligation to support that kind of trust. So, these are the basic founding principles of research ethics. I want to take a minute and look at one mode to see how these principles impact that mode of research. So, internet research ethics. How does the internet fit into research? Well, there are two essential functions. First, it's a tool for research. So we can go to the Marist Library site, we can Google, we can use the internet and all the information out there as a brilliant source of research. That's secondary research. But it's also a medium or a locale of research. So, for example, we could study World of Warcraft, or God help us all, chat roulette. This was perhaps the funniest but clean picture of chat roulette that I could find. So if there's a host of social, leadership, relational, all kinds of issues that we could study in online virtual environments that are particularly interesting setting. So there are some definite virtual complications that arise from research using the internet as the mode or the locale of research. First is certainly public and private data. Data sensitivity is certainly an issue, but in terms of what's public and what's private, that's a bit of a challenge. So forums, listservs, chat rooms, etc., those are all public settings. So, for example, if someone's Facebook profile and pictures were public, then they're fair game for being used in any kind of research. If they're private, then they wouldn't be. So a single place on the internet, like Facebook, could both be public and private all at the same time. That's a challenge, especially with data sensitivity. One of my friends has an assignment for her interviewing class where they do reports on one another based on what is searchable in public spaces on people. And sometimes what their classmates come back with is pretty embarrassing. That's the challenge with the internet in particular, is the public versus private data. Second, and related, is anonymity and confidentiality. So, there are a lot of people who have screen names and in blogs and a lot of places use their virtual identity as strongly in a lot of cases as they use their normal face-to-face offline identity. So do you protect that? Do you list the screen names? Do you list the pseudonyms? And how does informed consent? All of this gets problematized in a virtual setting. So it applies these things, the issue of anonymity and confidentiality, can certainly apply to the public settings, but are more specific to private data. But these are issues that there aren't clear-cut answers for at this point. Third, human rights and ownership rights. In traditional research, the researcher controls and owns the data. We're responsible for making sure that it's ethical, making sure that everything is good to go. We own it. On the internet, that data that's available in public spaces to the researcher can also be available to the participant, but also to the server and website. So the question is then, who owns it? This relates to copyright issues, especially for published research. So if you use something off of someone's blog, that can be copyrighted material. And if you use it, you can be in violation of a lot of different kinds of copyright laws. In almost all of my presentations, I violate copyright laws by using photos that are definitely copyrighted. For academic purposes, we have the fair use exemption. I could, however, never post my lectures in a genuinely public space because I would be then reposting someone else's copyrighted material. In a research setting, that's the same kind of an issue that we're talking about. And finally, we have a couple more that are interesting. Respect for people and their autonomy. As I've mentioned, there are challenges for informed consent. Cyber stalking is so easy. And the thing is that universities and some studies of ethical reviews of offline versus online studies or online research, universities and publications aren't really checking whether people have informed consent for their virtual studies like they do for their offline studies. Additionally, when we think of public space, our digital footprint is growing, so what we can put out there and live in public space and be taken is also growing. That can lead to the use of material in ways that it was never intended to be used. The goofy pictures of me and my friends, if my Facebook profile is public, can be taken by really anyone doing almost anything. And what's interesting, though, is that blogs don't meet the definition of a human subject, so they're not actually regulatable in the same way in terms of those research ethics principles that interviews would be, or that survey research would. So we haven't, our definition and our regulations of these haven't even caught up with the technology yet. The final issue is probably the most fun: recruitment. Because recruitment online is a challenge. And I really think it's best summarized with this picture. How do you know what you're getting? That is probably the biggest challenge with online recruitment of participants, is that they can be anybody. The normal things that we screen for are much more challenging. It's much more difficult to get the people, to get the sample, and to get the population that we're actually targeting. So we have to be very careful in a virtual setting of that. All right. On that alarming visual note, I will leave you. Remember, watch the Milgram and the Stanford videos looking for those basic 4 core principle issues that comprise good ethical research: the respect for privacy, informed consent, voluntary consent, and doing no harm.